In a now famous experiment, psychologist Harry Harlow took newborn rhesus monkeys away from their mothers and allowed them to choose between two artificial mothers. One made of wire provided food but no comfort. The other, covered in cloth, provided some comfort but no food. Time and again, the baby monkeys chose the cloth mother over the wire mother, suggesting that even a little bit of soft comfort was more important to them than food.
And this simple, basic reaction made us believe that we could define and measure what had previously been undefinable and unmeasurable, the baby's love for its mother.
As the monkeys who'd been taken from their mothers grew up, Harlow noticed something else. The monkeys experienced a wide range of social and emotional problems, from aggressive outbursts to uncontrollable fear, all because they hadn't been loved. It was a dramatic experiment, in many ways an awful experiment. I've seen this film 100 times, and every time I see it, I think, my God, this is torture. But that was exactly Harlow's point. Harlow wanted to show that you could take care of a monkey's every physical need, but if you deprived it of love, you could destroy its life.
If not for that early research on monkeys and their need for love and comfort, I don't think we ever would have framed questions about why some of the children coming out of these institutions are having the kinds of problems that they did. The lesson that I think we've learned is that it's not just about food, shelter, water, that a basic need for human beings is love, is companionship, are close relationships.
Harlow's experiments showed that a failure to bond has dire consequences. But how exactly does this happen? Dr. Pollack believes the answer has something to do with a brain chemical called oxytocin, which researchers recently learned plays an important role in social relationships.
Oxytocin was identified as being a hormone that helps with the formation of attachments. That is a hormone that allows the brain to form close relationships and allows an individual to feel a sense of calm and comfort when close to somebody that they care for.
To investigate this hypothesis, Pollack tested two groups of 4-year-old children. One group raised by biological parents, and another made up of adopted children who'd spent an average of 16 months in an Eastern European orphanage.
Touch the face that shows how the little boy is feeling.
It looks like happy.
Both groups were asked to play a computer game. But the game wasn't the real point. What Pollack wanted to know was how the children responded to the comfort and care of their parent. Pollack measured the amount of oxytocin in the child's body before and after the test. Among children who were raised by their biological parents, oxytocin levels shot up. But the children who were raised in orphanages showed no oxytocin increase at all.
The kids with the early neglect never showed the oxytocin release even with their mom. So something that should have resulted in an increase in oxytocin, physical comforting from a parent, did not.
That's you. You choose one for mommy.
Choose one for me?
And put it on.
There are many reasons why children who've been neglected as babies find it hard to form secure relationships as adults. But Dr. Pollack's results seem to identify one of the biological mechanisms underlying the problem.
Adult.
The key behind the oxytocin, and this is just my speculation, is it's about reward. Love could be a lot like a drug. It's something that we crave, and when we take it, it results in pleasurable, rewarding feelings. If being close to someone doesn't have that rewarding value, it's not going to have the same meaning. And so I think the big question to ask here is, when your early relationships have been disrupted, do social relationships have the same reward?
These studies suggest that a child's brain is, to some extent, molded by love. That we are, in a very real sense, wired to connect.
Family is above everything. It's above the individual. It's above independence. There's sort of a required self-sacrifice for the family.
I grew up in a very passionate family, a very loud family, lots of kids.
Because always people, what was it about your childhood
that caused you to act like this. As much as I'd like to blame my parents, I can't do that.
There were two people there who are older than me, who gave me money and fed me. I'm sure they did love me, you know, but it wasn't like I'd come home, come here, Sonny, come here, ooh, I love you, you know, nothing like that.
But attachment doesn't just affect a child's biology. Attachment is a two-way street. And just as children's brains are changed by the presence of their parents, so too are parents' brains changed by the presence of their child. In a delivery room in Houston, Texas, the attachment process has already begun. Not once, but twice.
You got a buddy in there, huh?
Shauna and Jeremy Jones are having twins.
Yeah, it's gonna be Donnie and David, the names of their grandfathers.
Grandsons.
Donnie, this is David.
Oh, there he is. Okay, buddy.
All right, all right.
It's clear that no one has to tell Donnie and David how to reach out to their parents, and no one has to tell their parents how to respond.
Found your finger.
When David was 1 day old, he made a noise like, and I made a noise back to him, hey. And he made a noise back, and I made a noise back, and kind of went back and forth. It was kind of a really, I'll never forget that. It was our first conversation. What y'all doing hanging out?
Reciprocal interaction with children, we believe, is very important for child development. There is a feedback loop that's established when the parent says, coos at a child, and the child's able to coo back, and the parent responds to that. The child has this feeling, I am being paid attention to.
It's like no other relationship with somebody that you meet, you're figuring them out, and this was just instantaneous. Just from the moment that they put them in my hands when they were born, there really aren't any words to describe that.
Right. There we go. Yay.
Babies are cute in a way that attracts adults. We have almost an innate reaction, a visceral response to seeing a beautiful baby face smile at us.
The subtle power of a baby's smile intrigues developmental pediatrician Lane Strathern. In a recent experiment, he set out to investigate what happens in a mother's brain when she sees her baby smile.
In our experiment, we wanted to look at what brain areas are activated and how it may differ when the baby's happy or sad.
Dr. Strathern brought 28 new mothers into his laboratory and videotaped their babies making a range of facial expressions.
Hey.
He then asked each mother to enter a magnetic resonance imaging chamber, and he monitored her brain activity as the images of her child were replayed. Strathern noticed something interesting. When a mother watched her child smile, certain parts of her brain were activated, the same parts that are activated when people think about food or sex.
These reward circuits give us the information that this is something that we need to pay attention to.
So the brain is saying, I am in the presence of something very important and potentially very good.
That's right. And I think when mothers see their baby, that's the signal that they need to hear. This baby is completely dependent on them, and they need to respond to those signals in order to optimize their baby's development.
This is nature's way of making sure that children are taken care of. But sometimes circumstances get in the way. Researchers now know that attachment can unfold in a variety of ways, some of which are much better than others. In central Pennsylvania, first-time mother Danielle Fife is eager to give her baby the best start she can in life. But the odds are stacked against her. She's single, living below the poverty line, and gets little help from family or friends.
I didn't really have support from anybody. I pretty much had myself. Having a baby changes your life completely, and I didn't realize that until it happened. The other day, Mackenzie colored her nose blue. It was funny though. Like, I should have took a picture, but I didn't. My first thought of being a mom was, okay, am I ready for this? Am I financially ready? I don't really have a good job. I don't have a house. I'm not where I want to be in life yet to have a child. I thought how my mom was and how I don't want to be, you know, I didn't want to be like that.
Hi, guys.
Over a year ago, before her daughter was born, Danielle turned to the Nurse Family Partnership, a pioneering program aimed at helping first-time low-income mothers develop parenting skills. Psychologist David Olds founded the program to make sure attachment unfolds in the best possible way.
I think that all of us, as human beings, are wired to protect our children, to nurture our children. And I think that it's important as we think about these issues to recognize that the survival of our species depends upon our being good parents.
And she's going to want to feed herself. Very important to let her do that,
Yes.
have that independence we want.
Dr. Olds has seen firsthand how daily stresses can easily overwhelm mothers like Danielle and lead to attachment problems.
Involve baby in imagination and rhythm games.
The things that lead to a secure attachment, nurturing, understanding, making the child feel cared for, can be taught. And this is the work of the Nurse Family Partnership.
Whatever you start with her now at this age, and do it consistently, the same thing at about the same time every day.
Right.
She's going to start remembering that. What plays off of that then comes trust, because they know the same thing's going to happen every day at the same time.
Baker's man.
If parents accurately read their children's signals, the child is more likely to develop a sense of security, a sense of trust in the world, and that will lead the child to be what researchers refer to as being securely attached.
It's just nice to have someone tell you, okay, like this is what to expect. With like the little social skills and stuff, it's cool to see how your baby is developing. I mean, you go to the doctor, all they do is weigh them, measure them, say, oh, you're doing a great job, see you in, you know, a month or two.
Does your baby stiff?
We've tested the program in 3 separate scientifically controlled studies, found that the children were less likely to exhibit disruptions in their early emotional behavior. So these early emotional expressions have been affected by the intervention.
Have a good rest of the day.
Oh, you too.
I didn't know anything about bringing up kids when I first had kids, but really nothing. I mean, I knew that there were 2 techniques. I knew that there was being a doormat, and I knew that there was severe punishment and real strictness, and I didn't like either of those things.
I feel I'm a pretty good father. I'm not spending every weekend, every hour of every weekend with them, but I don't think they want to spend that much time with me anyway. Did I want to be with my parents when I was 14, 12, 14? No. No, I wanted to avoid being with my parents.
I happen to have a lot of kids, like 6 kids and 2 marriages, so, and to see that, I mean, it's corny, you know, but that miracle, it is amazing. And so it gives you a good perspective, and I think it made me appreciate other stuff. For example, you're home with 2, 3, 4 kids, all of a sudden you're like, man, that tennis thing doesn't seem too hard.
The ability to bounce back is admirable, but it isn't unusual. People who suffer a wide range of traumas and tragedies tend to recover more quickly than they themselves would have predicted. Yes, they're sad, they're miserable, they're even devastated for a while. But studies show that most people end up being as happy or nearly as happy as they were before. Resilience isn't rare. In fact, it's very common.
There is some set point to happiness that you tend to return toward. And for some people, it's very happy, and for other people, it's mildly happy. And unfortunately, for a few people, it may not be happy. But the set point is good in the sense that when we have something terrible in our life happen to us, we get very depressed, we get less satisfied with our life. But slowly over time, we come back toward that set point.
This process is critical to human happiness. But how do we do it? And why do some of us do it so much more easily than others? For more than 15 years, Dr. Dennis Charney has been studying people who've shown exceptional resilience after trauma. From survivors of natural disasters, to prisoners of war, to the firemen who responded when the World Trade Center was attacked on September 11th.
It was fascinating to deal with resilient individuals because when you met them, you looked at them and thought, well, how did you do this? You start thinking, could I have done that? How did they do it?
One of Charney's most interesting subjects was Bob Shoemaker, a former Navy pilot.
I grew up on a farm in western Pennsylvania, and my parents were middle class, so I consider myself fairly average. But average people get thrown into extraordinary situations.
Bob's ordeal began in 1965 when he was assigned to combat duty in Vietnam. He'd just been married and had a son. Then suddenly, life as he knew it came to an end.
The mission I was on was just north of the demilitarized zone that separated North Vietnam from South Vietnam. We were really low, and I pulled out right over a flak site, and they managed to hit me in the tail section, and the plane flipped upside down, and I ejected, and the parachute fortunately opened, but opened only 35 feet above the ground, and so I broke my back as I landed. That was it. You know, they got me, they bound me, had handcuffs on me behind my back, and marched me off.
For 8 years, Shoemaker was shuttled between North Vietnamese prisons, including the infamous Hanoi Hilton, where he was brutally tortured.
The really worst technique was what we call the rope treatment, where they would tie a rope from your handcuffs up over your shoulders and down to your feet, and they would tighten this thing up so that eventually your head would reach your feet. And you think it can't happen, you know, particularly when your knees are straight, but it was excruciating. And then they jammed an iron bar down my throat to keep me from screaming. So that was the technique that would get you to condemn your own grandmother if you had to.
The torture Shoemaker endured was not just physical. For almost 3 years, he was held in solitary confinement.
There were 11 of us in cells and no windows and a solitary light bulb hanging down that burned 24 hours a day.
To deal with his isolation, Shoemaker imagined the house that he would build for his young family if he ever returned.
I'm almost embarrassed to admit to you that there would be days when I would spend maybe 10 or 12 hours just thinking about how many bricks were in this house. I knew that there were, say, 5,227 nails in the thing and so many board feet of lumber. I'd spend a year and a half designing the perfect house, and then one day I'd say, well, what would happen if I moved the fireplace from this room to that room? It'd send me back to square one, and I'd redesign the thing.
Although Shoemaker was physically isolated from the other prisoners, together they created an ingenious form of communication.
We developed the tap code in which the alphabet was arranged in a square that had 5 rows and 5 columns. You'd say, that's the second row, second column, this is G. That's first row, second column B, and U is fourth row, fifth column is the U, so GBU was God bless you. So the tap code really kept our spirits alive, our hopes alive, our dreams. And so we transmitted things like French lessons through the wall and music lessons and how to fix a television set and biology lessons. So we spent a lot of time on the wall.
These conversations were crucial to Shoemaker's survival, and they became a focus of Dennis Charney's research.
Social support is a key factor in becoming a resilient individual. You can't do it alone. You need other people. I think the tap code experience of the POWs is among the most important lessons. And we use the phrase that everybody needs a tap code. Everybody needs a way of communicating with other people to establish friendships that are supportive, to establish relationships that provide you a guidepost as you get through tough times.
Charney also discovered that highly resilient people tended to share some other qualities as well. They tended to have strong religious or moral beliefs, strong role models, and a strong streak of optimism.
It was not an unrealistic optimism. They were able to accurately apprise themselves of what they were facing. So it wasn't denial. They knew that they had been traumatized or they were facing a very difficult situation. But they had an ability to be optimistic that somehow that they would prevail.
You know, I only received 7 letters in 8 years, and the letters were occasionally were pessimistic, like telling me my mother had suddenly died and things like that. And you just have to be able to, you know, just suck it up and reach down somewhere in your soul and come out with the wherewithal to overcome the present circumstances and be upbeat and get on with it.
After 8 years of captivity, Bob Shoemaker was finally released, his spirit unbroken by the horrors he endured. The first thing he did was call his wife.
I wondered who this man was. I didn't know him very much. We had a very short courtship. Our baby was born just 5 weeks before Bob was shot down and captured. I remember this phone call saying, "Hi, honey," and that literally erased 8 years of time. It's hard to explain that, but that was the person I knew. And that was the person that returned home.
Shoemaker had done more than just survive. In his view, he had grown.
Well, I suppose one way of looking at 8 years of imprisonment is to say, hey, that's just wasted time. You know, have to put that behind me. It's unfortunate. But paradoxically, you know, I gained something out of this 8 years of experience.
In the years after his release, Shoemaker became a rear admiral, a college professor, a devoted husband and father. And he turned the house that he'd so often imagined into a reality.
There was something in my soul I just had to get out, you know, and see the fulfillment. I wanted a house that had a lot of openness to it, and I think that was probably as a result of my being confined without windows or anything. So the house I designed has a lot of glass. I was deprived of freedom for such a long time. I think I really cherish freedom more than most people do now.
Bob, like almost all the other POWs that we interviewed and got to know very well, said that to the following question: if you could have eliminated the POW experience from your life, would you do so? In other words, you could have just wiped that out. It never happened. And Bob, like many of the others, said no, because I learned things about myself during that experience. And I learned tools, psychological tools, tools in which to handle my life that I probably could never learn in any other way. And so it stood me in good stead for the rest of my life.
Being a prisoner really focuses on what's essential in life, and there are a lot of things that we can do without and still be happy.
The key lessons from Bob Shoemaker's story are that inside almost all of us is the capacity to overcome the most horrific of stresses in our life and even ultimately learn from that stress and thrive and grow as a person.
You learn resilience by falling down and getting back up again. And as you fall down and get back up again, you say, oh my God, I'm back up again. The setback or the failure that I thought I would never recover from, in fact, I've recovered from perfectly well, which means that I can do that again.
My resilience has been slowly learning to trust that whatever path I take can be positive. You know, even the worst decisions I've made have had, you know, positive ramifications if I choose to learn from them.
Well, I want to make sure that people know that I'm happy that I had a messed up childhood, that I'm glad I was damaged, because it made me a better actor, maybe a better writer, maybe a better creator. So I thank my family for that. I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. Then I would have, but not now.
Human beings have a talent for adapting, a talent for finding happiness where we'd least expect it. But if we can adapt to a lifetime in a wheelchair or a decade in prison, then why can't we adapt to the ordinary misfortunes of everyday life? The answer is that adaptation is something the mind does when there's nothing else it can do. We adapt to misfortunes when we know we can't change them. But when we stand a fighting chance, we fight. And that's why we struggle so much with temporary misfortunes. This is Framingham, Massachusetts. In 1948, medical researchers began tracking the residents of this town, trying to learn about the behaviors that cause heart disease. Their work continues today. Known as the Framingham Heart Study, it's one of the world's most extensive epidemiological studies, containing 6 decades worth of data on the health of more than 15,000 people. And hidden in this mountain of data is a deep and powerful secret about the nature of human happiness.
Your happiness depends upon whole large clusters of people you don't even know and who you have no way of knowing.
Nicholas Christakis is a physician and a sociologist. He became interested in the Framingham study not because he was interested in heart disease, but because he was interested in social connections.
These individuals had had their social network ties repeatedly assessed over this 32-year period, and as it turns out, had had various aspects of their emotional lives assessed as well. So what we could tell is we could tell who these people were connected to every 4 years or so for 30 years, and we could tell, for example, whether they were happy or depressed or lonely, and in some cases anxious, repeatedly across time.
Using the Framingham data, Christakis and his colleagues mapped out a web of more than 50,000 connections between friends, family, and coworkers who participated in the study. Then they began to calculate how changes in the happiness of any single person affected the happiness of others in this vast web of relationships. The results were astounding.
What we found is that if your friend becomes happy, it increases the probability that you will become happy by about 15%. And if your friend's friend becomes happy, someone you don't even know perhaps, it increases the probability that you'll become happy by about 10%. It's only when we get to 4 degrees of separation, only when we're speaking of your friend's 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 friend, that that person's emotional state is no longer associated with your emotional state.
Everyone knows that people can make each other happy. But before this study, no one had any idea just how powerful this effect could be. Christakis' work shows that happiness spreads through social networks like a virus, that happiness is, in a very real sense, contagious. There's no doubt about it. We're all connected. And those connections exert a powerful influence on our happiness. Sometimes they can even save our lives.
I lived here about 40 years ago when I was a kid. Just walking in the door of my house was so unpleasant.
Michael Mattis was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and the troubled relationships of his childhood left an indelible mark.
I was an only child. I grew up with my mother and my grandmother. My mother worked 2 jobs as a waitress to support us because my grandmother was home all the time taking care of me. The lid came off that predictable situation by 2 events. My grandmother died, which left us in a void, and then my stepfather came in. And that's when the alcoholism reared its head. My mother would be in bed. My stepfather would be up in a chair with cocktail in hand. My mother would be bedridden for maybe up to a month. And she would even call for me in a drunken tone to bring her a drink or food or something like that. I was, of course, bitter and angry about what was now going on. In essence, I'd lost my mother, the mother that I had known, to this alcoholic life. And that's when I began to really start living more on the streets and started to get into trouble with my friends, my new family. And the trouble started simply with shoplifting, escalated to burglaries, car thefts, so that we were pretty much running around doing what we wanted. Right over here was my friend's house. He used to deal LSD right out of the back of the house there. A good source for all of us at the time. I and my friends, we'd just do everything in our power to find ways to alter our mood. We'd, drinking, drugs, LSD, speed, you name it. It was pretty much anything we can get our hands on. Right up here on the left is a house that we were all holed up in, and we were busted up there by a very spectacular bunch of police outside, and they had us right over here in front of this house, all of us pinned down, handcuffed on the ground. I was arrested 24 times total. The vast majority of that was for car theft, occasional break-ins, and other sorts of misdemeanors, drunken behavior, disorderly stuff, and the like. But I remember every time going down to the juvenile detention center with its drab green cement walls and just a profound sense of depression that would occur within me and just the hopelessness. And to this day, I can remember the deep, gut-wrenching depression that I would come over me in a wave. I don't know what the future holds. I had a meeting with my parole officer after I'd been arrested one more time subsequently. And I was sitting in the car outside the high school, and he told me, "You're done. One more arrest, and you're going to be tried as an adult." I had at least the insight to know that if I stayed in this environment, I was going to get in trouble again.
Although many of his friends would soon be in prison, fate had something different in mind for Mattis, whose life was changed forever by a single social connection.
I got a job at a very high-end furniture store that sold very expensive modern furniture. It's an environment that allowed me to learn a lot about the other side of life, where there was money, culture, art, wine, and the like. And this is something I had not experienced before, so it allowed me to become aware of this as a possibility. But the real transition for me in terms of helping to guide me came through fluke interaction that I had in delivering furniture to a surgeon. It was a very big job that we had, and I ended up going out there multiple times to install custom-made furniture. And so I got to know him. For whatever reason, he saw something in me, and he decided to take me under his wing.
My first impressions of Mike when he first came in the door, there was a spark there that was blatantly obvious to me. And his persistence in pursuing our relationship was conspicuous, and it was infectious.
I write a letter to the dean of the medical school. I mean, it makes no sense. I wouldn't do it today. Right.
I would go out to his house on Saturdays and just hang out with him, and he might take a nap on the couch while I would sit there and watch football or something. But when it came time for me to ask him questions and get some guidance, he always gave me the right advice.
He said, I had a difficult time even getting a high school diploma, and I haven't been to college, and I can't read, and I can't add a column of numbers together. And my response to that was, well, just do it.
He saw worth in me, and it could be developed. And that was what decided my fate. I'm a full professor of thoracic surgery in the Department of Surgery at the University of Minnesota. And I landed upon surgery when I got onto the rotation as a medical student. All of a sudden, here we are in a high adrenaline environment, risky activity, life and death, all the things that were certainly embedded in me and my past and how I grew up. I fit in just perfectly.
The story of Mike's life illustrates beautifully what happens in childhood, and going down a dark road doesn't doom you. That you can turn your life around, and you can construct a new life with the help of other people.
Psychologist Ann Maston studies how children respond to adversity. She became interested in Mattis because of the way he used his adult relationships to overcome a troubled youth.
He encountered people who began to care about him. He connected with mentors who opened doors for him and coached him.
Yeah, we probably should check without clothes, but why don't you?
For almost 30 years, Mastin has been working on a study that tracks over 200 people, many of whom, like Mattis, grew up in difficult circumstances.
We recruited them when they were 8 to 12 years old, and then we followed them up after about 7 years, 10 years, and then 20 years. We wanted to study what was happening both when things were going well and when things were not going so well. And we learned a lot about the nature of stress that kids encounter, and also about all the kinds of protective factors that seem to make a difference in children's lives.
Mastin's findings tell us that the key to overcoming childhood adversity lies in developing strong relationships with competent and caring individuals, regardless of how or when we meet them.
When you're young, they're parenting type figures. When you're older, they can be mentors, friends, romantic partners.
Any concerns or issues? You got any pains? Anything new overnight?
In Mike's case, these kind of people came into his life late when he was at the doorstep of adulthood. And he was optimistic, even though he probably didn't have too many reasons to be optimistic. And I think people around him responded to that, to his motivation and interest in going in a new direction. And I think what you see in his life is a kind of positive snowball.
When I reflect back about how did this happen, how did I manage to make a success out of this mess? I go back to the observation of others and using those as significant opportunities for personal development. Without a doubt, one of the most important things that bring me happiness is being engaged in my family, in taking care of them, in fostering my children's development, in being a good husband to my wife. These are sometimes trite comments that people make, you know, being a good husband, being a father, and all that stuff, but I actually mean it, and it's something I came to learn. It wasn't something that was just immediate. For me, happiness means being engaged in things that involve other people and being committed to something that is about other people.
Social connections are clearly the key to happiness. That's a cause for celebration, but it's also a cause for worry, because as people age, their social networks get smaller and smaller, which suggests that the older we get, the unhappier we should become. And yet, surprising new evidence reveals it's usually the other way around.
As we get older, we're increasingly clear about what our strengths are, what our weaknesses are. We're increasingly clear about who cares about us and who doesn't. And so we're able to mold our worlds better.
Over the last 2 decades, psychologist Laura Carstensen has been monitoring hundreds of individuals to see how their emotional lives change as they age.
We recruited a group of participants who were initially aged 18 to 94. And we asked them to carry an electronic pager with them. Each time they were paged, we asked them to tell us the extent to which they were feeling each of 19 different emotions. And we had them give us this information 35 times during a week.
Carstensen's findings tell us that people become increasingly positive as they grow older, as long as they aren't suffering from physical pain or debilitating illness.
It was pretty dramatic. Essentially, what we found is that 70-year-olds were experiencing fewer negative emotions than 40-year-olds. 40-year-olds were experiencing fewer negative emotions than 20-year-olds.
In later studies, Carstensen identified several causes for this remarkable shift.
Humans know that they're mortal. We know that we have only a certain amount of time on this planet. And this changes people's motivation and changes their emotional experience. As we age, it appears that people are better at experiencing the moment, enjoying what they're doing at a particular point in time. In some sense, it's the silver lining of getting old, that we don't have to prepare for the future. We don't have the burden of the future.
The major consequence of this change? older people tend to alter their social behavior.
When motivation shifts so you're focusing on what matters most in life, for most people, they start to focus on their relationships and their closest relationships.
You value your friendships, you value your children, your family.
Betty Schneider is 87 years old. She's one of hundreds of elderly people who have participated in Carstenson's studies.
As I've become older, it seems that I really appreciate my life even more. When I was younger, I didn't even think about old age, but it turned out to be wonderful.
Betty is a widow. Her husband, Jack, succumbed to a stroke 6 years ago. But like many people in her situation, she doesn't dwell on the loss. In fact, her daily life is remarkably busy. She takes classes, spends time with her grandchildren, and has a full social schedule.
I miss Jack. We did so many things together. We were married for 61 years. And after Jack passed on, it was pretty glum. And gradually it's become better again. There's lots going on, and he would enjoy a lot of the things that I'm doing. But I'm sorry he's not here. But I'm just so glad we had all those years.
In some ways, it challenges our most fundamental assumptions about happiness, because we think that happiness is derived from youth and power and attractiveness, health, all of these things that decline with age. But yet we're finding that among older people who are clearly suffering these kinds of losses are also somehow experiencing life emotionally better than ever.
I feel very fortunate. I often go through all the good things that have happened, what's been good today. It's interesting, younger people don't really believe that you can be optimistic and feel positive about things that are happening when you're old. But believe me, you do. And I know I don't have a long time to live, but it's turned out to be a very, very rewarding time.